Welcome, everyone. My name is Christina Paternoster, and I'm one of the co-leads for the Rural Learning Collaborative, along with Shannon Robshaw and Matt Buckman. Thank you for joining us today. We'll do some housekeeping while we wait for some late joiners. When you signed up for today's webinar, you were automatically placed on our listserv, so you'll receive a notice when the recording of this presentation is posted, as well as receiving other resources and updates that are periodically sent through the listserv. If you'd rather not be on the listserv, you can simply reply when you get your message, and we'll take care of removing you. But the listserv is really a great resource for those of you living in rural communities, so I'd suggest you take a peek around before you decide. You can also, on your own, join the Absorb community, which hosts our online platform at Ideas at the Institute, which we'll put a link in the chat box so you could easily check it out. There are actually several great communities you can join in addition to ours. Also, we hope you're planning to attend the Training Institute June 30th, starting June 30th in Orlando. If you are, you'll have the opportunity to meet all of us and even some other learning community leaders. There's information on how to do that when you register, and I'm sure we'll be sending out information to registrants as the date gets closer. We'd love to meet you all, hear your ideas, get to network a little bit. At the end of today's presentation, we'll ask for your feedback in a really short survey. So look for that when you're done and let us know what you think. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. And oftentimes people will ask questions as they're thinking about that. That's great. We'll just consolidate those and ask them at the end. I have one last thing on my list before we get started. We want to check in with our audience and see who's joining us today. So we'll launch that first poll. So if you take a moment and let us know a little bit about your organization. And if you're going to check other, by all means, please take a moment and let us know what that other means in the comment box. I see we have some family organizations represented. That's great to see. We'll give it just another second if you want to let us know where you're joining from. That's always helpful for our presenters. Great. All right, so we have one more quick survey. We want to know, what's your role at the organization that you work for? And again, if you fit into the other box, let us know in the chat. Oh, great. We've got a lot of family support partners. That's really great. Nice to see you joining us. I'm sure you'll have some great insights and questions for us. Anybody else? All right. Let's do one more question. Can you let us know, are you currently providing specific services for Grandfamilies? Oh, it looks like we're getting a few that do. That's great. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. So I think it's kind of funny that in planning this webinar focusing on Grandfamilies, we all went out and looked for presenters doing interesting work in their local community. And I don't think we actually shared with one another as co-leads who we were thinking of, but it happened to turn out that both of our presenters are from Tennessee. So it was a very happy accident, which speaks to the quality of services offered in the state, so congratulations. First up is Dr. John Paul Abner. Dr. Abner is the director of PCIT, which, as you know, is Parent-Child Interaction Therapy, training for Northeast Tennessee Center for Excellence for Children in State Custody. Dr. Abner is one of only 21 people in the world who has been designated as a PCIT master trainer by PCIT International, so we're really thrilled to have him with us here today. I will mention to our audience that Dr. Abner has to rush off after his Q&A for another engagement, so there will be time for questions, but usually we offer an additional Q&A time after both presentations. We won't be able to do that with Dr. Abner today. Dr. Abner, it's all yours.
And Dr. Abner, just be sure that you are not muted. You may be on mute. So we are still having some issues.
Yeah.
Yep, you have to unmute your telephone. No, we cannot. Okay, so let's have you. So my apologies, everyone. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulty. So Dr. Abner, if you could just hang up and redial back in using the information over in the presenters chat, and we'll get you connected in just a moment. I'm going to repost that information for you at the very bottom. Our apologies, everyone. As we get reconnected, we will be back in just a few moments. Technology does not always go as planned, even when you prepare.
All right, are we on now?
Yes, we are.
Hey, we are working. That is excellent. All right, well, I apologize for the challenges there with our phone system. As it was noted, sometimes technology does not go quite as planned. So really excited to be talking about grandparents and caregivers today, and excited to be with y'all on this webinar. One of the things that I'm going to start off with is just some statistics about grandparents raising grandchildren. And one of the things that I'm going to start off is giving some numbers to something that y'all already know, and that is that the number of custodial grandparents has increased significantly over the past decade. Currently, more than 2.5 million grandparents report that they are responsible for the primary caregivership of their grandchildren. And so for those of y'all who are feeling, it just seems like there are so many more grandparents who are responsible for their grandchildren, your feeling is reflected by the national statistics. Just some other statistics about grandparents who are living with a grandchild. Recognize that grandparents who live with a grandchild tend to be younger, so they tend to be younger than typical grandparents. They are much more likely to be living in poverty than other grandparents, and they also typically have lower levels of education than other grandparents. So one of the things to note is that many times our grandparents who are caring for their grandchildren have significantly more barriers than even their peers as grandparents. Generally speaking, the highest percentage of grandparents caring for their grandchildren come into the age of 50 to 59, and with about 2% under 39 and 4% about ages 80 and over. Now, one of the interesting things to me here in Tennessee, which is smack dab in the middle of the opioid epidemic, is that the percentage of grandparents raising their grandchildren is typically much higher in states that have a higher opioid prescribing rates. So if you take a look at this state map here, this is the percentage of the population ages 30 and over who are responsible for their grandchildren, with that purple color being colors where you have the heaviest concentration of grandparents responsible for their grandchildren. And then you pop over to our next map, which is the opioid prescription, and the dark orange is the highest opioid prescribing rates. You will see that they pretty much overlap with one another. So that states where you have lots of grandparents raising their grandkids, you also typically have a lot of opioid prescribing rates. Other than the state of Texas, which is kind of interesting to me. But, and I think one of the things that this reflects is that typically when grandparents are raising their grandchildren, it is because there is some external influence that is causing a disruption in the family, whether that is opioid abuse. Here in East Tennessee, we have a lot of methamphetamine abuse, and so there typically is something that is resulting in the grandparents having to step in to raise their grandchildren. There are a number of significant issues that are faced by grandparents. In a qualitative study by Lee and Blitz in 2016, there are about 5 major themes that emerged from the interviews. One of these was quite positive. 4 were a little bit more challenging. So one of the positive themes that emerged from the interviews with the grandparents was this chance to be a parent again. Whether it was being a parent was a role that they really enjoyed and they really are enjoying having an opportunity to raise children again, or they felt that they had made mistakes with their own children and they were looking to correct those mistakes with their grandchildren. You saw a lot of grandparents actually fairly excited to have that opportunity to be a parent again. On the other hand, there were a lot of themes of challenge that our grandparents were facing. One of those themes was dealing with their own aging factors. So recognize that, you know, as we get older, we tend to have more health problems. We tend to have more mobility issues. And so you have grandparents who are not only working on raising their children, but they're raising their grandchildren, but they're also trying to make sure that their own medical needs are met. And this can be quite challenging. Personally, I am an older father. I had my first child at 35 and my last child at 40. And most of my children are either flown the coop now to college or getting ready to do that. And I cannot imagine having enough energy to raise my grandchildren when I'm 65 or so. I'm a little tuckered out. And so when you're dealing with those aging issues, dealing with energy issues, that was one of the things that came up. Another thing that came up is that there was a real desire for grandparents raising their grandchildren to have a network to talk with other grandparents who are in that position. Grandparents sometimes felt very alone and isolated, and this is particularly true in rural communities. And grandparents talked a lot in this study about their desire and their need to work with other grandparent caregivers. Another thing that comes up not only in this study but in several other studies is that grandparents talk about having poor relationships and communications with teachers and school staff. Essentially, not only are you working with grandparents who may not have had a positive experience in their own schooling experience, but you are also looking at a grandparent who is about 3 generations removed from the educational culture. And so the education that they experience is far different from the education that their children are experiencing. I'm going to try to avoid going on one of my educational soapboxes, but a good example of this is kindergarten. When I was in kindergarten, the idea of kindergarten was that I was going to learn how to sit in a circle, not beat up Betty and Johnny, maybe learn my letters, learn my shapes. In today's kindergarten in the state of Tennessee, children are expected to come into kindergarten identifying all their shapes, being able to read at least 100 words, and ready to sit down and do academic schoolwork for much of the day. And while I do not think this is developmentally appropriate, those are the current expectations, and grandparents are often caught by surprise about the demands that are being placed on their grandchildren by the school systems. And one of the other issues is role conflict. And grandparents will often face significant role conflict. And I want to take a moment and just tell a quick story about my grandmother to kind of illustrate role conflict. Now, in front of you, you have a picture of a beautiful chocolate cake, which is not my grandmother's chocolate cake. It is from the 600 Acres blog, who was very nice enough to let us use this picture. But it is as close to what I could find to my grandmother's chocolate cake as I could find on the internet. And my grandmother was an awesome grandmother, and Grandmother Haygood, she might not have been the best grandmother in the world, but there is no doubt that she made the absolute best chocolate cake in the world. It was amazing. It was homemade chocolate cake with this homemade fudge frosting. She made one every Thursday. Everybody in Mount Pleasant, Tennessee knew that Grandma Haygood made that cake on Thursday, and many people would find an excuse to come in and eat that chocolate cake. Now, one of the things that is not like my grandmother's chocolate cake is you see this piece of cake standing because it's a nice triangle wedge. I did not know that that was how most people cut cake until I was about 17 years old, because Grandma's cake was so popular that if everybody was at Grandma's house, with the relatives, there was about 35, 40 people, everybody had to have a slice of cake. So not everybody would have a cake if you sliced it in those big triangles. Instead, you sliced off a couple of end slices, sliced it down the middle, and then you'd have about an inch little rectangle wedge that would not stand up on its own, and you would have that little slice of heaven. But recognize at the end, you had these 4 end slices that were covered in frosting, and they were the holy grail if you were a grandchild. Could you be the grandchild who somehow got that end slice? There would be fights about it. We would race to see who got the end slice. Now, I was lucky enough to spend 1 week every summer with my grandmother, and it was an amazing grandmother-grandchild experience. Grandma would play badminton with us. She'd play croquet with us. She would let me go running around the neighborhood, which my mother would never let me do. And I got to have Grandma's chocolate cake every day. And not only did I get to have it every day, I got to have not 1, but 2 end slices because I only had to share it with my sister. And Grandma would let me have chocolate cake for breakfast. And it was amazing. Oh my goodness. Now, so Grandma would, she'd walk us to the library. We'd go to the Five and Dime and get ices. We would have chocolate cake for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Perfect grandchild experience. Now, recognize I would return home tired, sugared up, pretty grumpy because I'd been playing with Grandma for a week. And Grandma loved being able to have that role, just providing totally, just total love, doing a little bit of spoiling, really engaging in that great grandmother-grandchild relationship. Now, if something had happened to my parents, I would have gone to stay with my Grandma Haygood. And I guarantee you, I would not get to eat chocolate cake for breakfast if my Grandmother Haygood was then placed into the parenting role, because the parent role and the grandparent role are 2 very different roles in families. And all of a sudden, when you have to raise a grandchild, you have this desire to be the grandparent, but you also have to have the rules enforcement to be the parent and to be the primary caregiver of that child. And so grandparents a lot of times face this real significant conflict of, oh my goodness, I have got to not only provide that total amount of just unconditional love, but I also have to provide the discipline to be a caregiver. And so this role conflict can sometimes be very challenging for grandparents, especially when they had originally hoped to be in that grandparent role, and then they find themselves in the primary caregiver role. So there are a lot of issues that our grandparents face. There's a lot of grief over the loss of that grandparent role, as well as grief over some of the challenges that might have impacted their sons, their daughters, so that they have had to take on the caregivership. There's a certain amount of loss of freedom. It is very challenging to go from being footloose and fancy-free after all the children have left the house to going back to the role of a primary caregiver, where you have to make sure that the children are taken care of before you can leave the house. A lot of guilt happens. It's like a guilt of, what have I done so that my children were not able to raise their grandchildren? Or guilt about, am I taking over this role of a primary caregiver from my own child? And so that guilt can happen. There is significant impact of trauma upon the grandchildren. Most of our grandparents who have caregiver kinship of their children, their grandchildren have experienced significant trauma and thus have the trauma symptoms that we see very frequently, whether that's problematic attachment behavior, whether that is difficulty with regulation of emotions, but they're going to have that. Plus, very commonly, the same trauma that has impacted the grandchildren has also impacted the grandparents. And so the grandparents are having to not only deal with their grandchildren's trauma, but also the vicarious traumatization that they're experiencing by knowing what their grandchildren and children have gone through. One of the other issues facing the grandparents sometimes is the feeling that they haven't had a choice in their caregivership. If you were to ask any of my family members about what would happen to my children if I were to pass and my wife were to pass, they would say, oh, by all means, what's going to happen is we'll take care of your kids. But none of my parents or sister right now are in a great position to take care of my kids. They would do it not because it was their best option, it was because they would see it as their only option, as duty and pride. And that's what a lot of our grandparents face when they start rearing their grandchildren. There's no choice. This is their option. This is what they're going to do. Definitely one of the issues that are going to be facing our grandparents are significantly increased stress. Raising children is a stressful occupation. I have a friend who likes to say that parenting is not for the weak. And I will tell you that grandparents raising grandchildren is definitely not for the weak, because it takes a lot of strength and a lot of courage to be a grand in that situation. And recognize that when we're talking about our grandparents serving our grandchildren, that there is, well, at least there may be a very large underserved population of our grandparents. Most in-depth studies of grandparents raising grandchildren use samples recruited from service providers. But many of our grandparents were raised at a time when social services were not to be trusted, family services were only for really broken families, and their family is not really broken. And so they don't seek out the services that they need and that their grandchildren need because they're either of the stigma of mental health services or just because that's not in their family culture to seek out those services. And so one of our interventions when we're thinking about grandparents raising grandchildren is outreach. How do we communicate to our grandparents that we have services that are available for them? And luckily, Connie is going to get into a little bit of that later today in her presentation. One of the things that I want to promote is just this idea that interventions targeted to grandparents can work. Chan et al. In a meta-analysis, they examined 20 studies that targeted specifically grandparent interventions. And what they found is that when you target grandparents, you will see increases in both social support and parenting skills. You see a decreases in children's behavior problems. And so recognize that all of our evidence-based treatments that we are using these days and that are really growing in focus in America They typically work with grandparents as caregivers, and if you target that to grandparents, it can even be more potent. When we're considering our interventions to grandparents, I think that there are some important considerations that we need to take into mind. One of those is language learning. Recognize that one of the things that's very consistent about the aging process is that as we age, it becomes much more difficult to learn a new language. So for example, if you are a 5-year-old and your family moves to Iceland, it's like you can learn Icelandic language pretty easily at 5. It's much more difficult if you move there at 10. It's even more difficult if you move there at 15. It's even more difficult if you move it at 25, and it can be quite impossible if you get there at 50 or 55, just because our brain does not process new language. We as human beings tend to process language very easily younger. It gets much more difficult older. Now, the result of this is a couple of things. I'm going to scroll back for a second to one of my roles in life. I frequently serve as a youth sponsor, and so even though my clinical specialty right now is 2 to 7-year-olds, one of my true loves is adolescents. I really enjoy working with teenagers. And one of the things I've had to learn with working with teenagers is that I am chronically uncool, and there's nothing I can do about it. And the reason why I'm uncool, the reason why I'm unhip is quite simple. I, as an older adult, am not going to pick up on the language of the youth as quickly as youth will. So for example, what this means is that about the time that I start to pick up on youth slang goes out. There was a phrase that lasted about 3 months. Back, I think it was in the 2000s, and if a kid found something very exciting, they would say, "Oh, that's the bomb." Some of y'all remember that. And I picked that phrase up about the time that it went out, and I used that phrase unintentionally. I knew it was unhip, but it was stuck in my language, and I would use that for about the next 2 to 3 years. Some of y'all will be using that today because I have brought it back up into your brains, and I apologize. But recognize that it takes longer as we get older to understand that with language, and it takes it takes longer for you to pick that up. And recognize with a lot of our evidence-based treatments, they have their own languages. I know I do parent-child interaction therapy, and we talk about labeled praises and behavior descriptions and unlabeled praises, and all of those words. Whereas a very young parent can sometimes pick them up very quickly, sometimes it takes a lot longer for our older grandparents to pick up that jargon. And thus, when we're doing direct intervention with our grandparents, we need to recognize that it may take them a little bit longer to pick up the jargon. Even when they're highly intelligent, their language centers may not be picking things up quickly. So that's a couple of things that we want to be thinking about doing to help. One is we want to use visual aids as much as possible so that not only are folks processing things linguistically, but they're also processing things visually. As much as possible as we can connect those experiences to their past learning experiences, that is going to help. So when we are teaching new concepts, we want to use examples that are going to connect with our older audiences. One quick example of this that I want to point out is one of my favorite interventions right now, which is child-adult relationship enhancement, which is CARE for short. CARE is typically a 1-day, sometimes a 2-day workshop for anybody who works with kids, but we found a lot of application with this with both foster parents and kinship placements. And so, what we found is that this particular intervention does a lot of hands-on learning, does a lot of role play, does a lot of game playing during the presentation of the material, and as a result, it sticks a little better. And so what you can see on the chart here, and I have to put on my reading glasses now, but what you can see on the chart is that folks who went through CARE showed significantly children who'd gone through care showed significantly lower amounts of depression and anxiety. We also got a lot less anger and aggression and significantly less hyperarousal. So it's like the care trainer tended to do a little better than training as usual in that institute. And I think that just gets at the point that we can do such a better job of providing interventions that are going to be appropriate for all of our caregivers as we work hard through that. Another intervention consideration is just stress management. All of us have our favorite sort of stress management techniques that we like to work with, and that is something that we want to overtly give to our grandparents raising their grandchildren. It's like this can be an extremely stressful experience, and whether that is mindfulness exercises or relaxation exercises, this is something that we want to be very conscious of giving to our grandparents. One of the other things that came up a lot in the literature is just the idea of school partnerships, that when you're thinking about a systemic intervention, school partnerships can be a very good thing to do. Grandparents identify communication with their schools and teachers as significant problem areas, and what they have found is that open houses can be a very useful tool for fostering relationships between schools and grandparents. Yes, I just found that typo, but open houses can be a really useful tool. Essentially, parent-teacher conferences a lot of times have sort of a stigma among caregivers that, oh, my child is in trouble, I have to go to this parent-child-teacher conference. And a lot of research has found that open houses tend to be a little bit more welcoming to our grand caregivers. Recognize that school personnel will state that they've had very little training in working with grandparents, whereas school personnel are often trained to work very closely with parents and caregivers. They're not as much trained to work with grandparents, and possibly specific interventions for our school system employees will be very helpful. Another thing that folks talk about is that as evidenced very early on in the statistics, a lot of times our grandparents who are raising their grandkids have a lower educational attainment on average. And now in our culture, as education becomes more and more a pathway to success, it may be helpful for grandparents to have college visits and to look at college preparation courses to understand. If a grandparent has not been to college and they have a child who is trying to get into college, college is a very different culture, and there are a lot of arcane things, lots of letters being thrown out that people don't understand. My kids just in October, we both were filling out the FAFSA. Well, what the heck is a FAFSA? Those of us who've been to college or have kids who go to college know about the FAFSA, but folks who've never had that experience are not as in tune and they may be the folks who would benefit most from that type of information. Another big issue is just increasing connectivity, and I talk about, I see Amy Young talked about in the public chat how connecting is very important, and so that perceived quality of relationships can really help the grandparents cope with their ongoing stress, and that enlarged interaction can be extremely helpful. Okay, and finally, we just want to increase the community opportunities with other grandparents raising their grandchildren. So I have a list of references there for you, and I think I have left some time for some questions. So we'll throw it open for questions. And I'll pop open my reading glasses here so if they come up on the thing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abner. Yeah, let's take some questions. Let's see what people have to say. Personally, I do have a question. I was wondering, you had mentioned that the poor relationships with teachers and school staff. How does that compare to your typical parent? Has there been any kind of comparison of that?
Sure. One of the things, so there's a couple of things that I found, and I'm about to move out of the research and into anecdotal. So just anecdotally with my grandparents that I have worked with, I have found a couple of things. One is because a lot of times of the trauma that their child has experienced, they are very protective and they are quick to rise to the occasion of defending their child. And a lot of times their quickness to defend their child can sometimes result in a problematic relationship with the teacher. You know, one of the things that I'm always trying to teach my parents when they have children who are experiencing some challenging behavior issues at school is, you know, try as hard as you can to maintain a positive relationship with the school, because that, like it or not, that impacts the quality of caregiving your child is going to receive at the school. And so sometimes I found my grandparents will rush to the defense of their child and sometimes enter into more confrontational relationships than some of my typical parents will in that situation. And once again, one of the biggest things is just the culture of school has changed so much in the last 30 years that a lot of times the grandparents are helpless. Well, helpless is a strong term, but a lot of times my grandparents are challenged in meeting the needs of their kids. A lot of my grandparents don't, you know, struggle to work with computer technology that their children are required to know for school. A lot of times, you know, math curriculums has changed greatly. That's a common joke that runs. You know, I can't do the math that my kids do, but a lot of times they can't do the math in the way that their kids are doing. So, so I think that, so I have found, and even when comparing in caregiver relationships, that sometimes my grandparents are so quick to rush to the defense of their grandchildren that they enter into these combative relationships with the teachers. And once again, that's totally anecdotal.
Yeah.
But it's something that I can. Yeah, but it's quite honestly, it's something that I can understand because it is something that I can understand because that gets back into that role conflict. It's like your role as a grandparent a lot of times is to provide that unconditional love and support for your child, and you know you're going to be extremely supportive of that. All right. So
yeah, that
I have got.
Makes sense.
All right. So I've got a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So I was just going to say, yeah, we have a question, and we can put this one out there again later as well, so we get it from both perspectives. Are there successful peer networks or support groups for grandparents that you know of?
And so my first answer to that is that, you know, from the literature, there are some very successful grandpeer networks and support groups that have been established. And, you know, and then from a personal standpoint, you know, as a parent-child interaction therapist, I tend to be more of an individual interaction. And so I'm gonna leave that question to Connie to answer better. And Amy Young has just posted on the public chat of a Facebook group called Grandfamilies that's really helpful. So, but I'm gonna pass that question on to Connie, who I think is going to be a little bit better equipped to answer that question.
Yeah, I think Facebook is really nice. Even if you're computer challenged, sometimes it's a little easier to get on Facebook. And while groups may not necessarily be in your area, you also can ask and not necessarily worry about that anonymity, because there may not be people from your area.
Oh, no, I think that any time that you are, and the other thing is just getting information. I think that information and knowledge is always a very powerful thing.
John Paul,
so I do hear, oh, go ahead, Matt.
Okay. A quick question, and then we'll come back over for your question there. Around unofficial guardianship, so I have a lot of families that will come in that they're not quite the guardian yet, but they're still raising the child, and there's some combination, whether it's actual formalized shared custody or if they just end up caring for the child. Are there any anecdotal lessons learned of with signing consent and who gets to consent for treatment. I know that varies from state to state.
Yeah.
Who gets involved? Is there a certain amount of when you start to focus on grandparents as the primary caregiver versus the biological parent as primary, and any research or ideas around kind of general adaptations whenever it comes to these kind of mixed families that really the caregiving is at least shared by grandparents?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. And, and my first response to that is going to be a weasel response, because my first response to that is going to be that, it's a little bit about asking a question of somebody on the autism spectrum, because there's going to be a different answer for every different family. I'm going to, when you talk about those types of caregiver relationships, I want to go to a very specific one that I actually see a lot of, and that is the grandparent raising the grandchild informally, but the parent is living with the grandparent. And I see that arrangement happen very frequently. And I think in that particular arrangement, one of the big challenges is a lot of times the parent has legal custody, but the grandparent is doing primary caregivership, and the parent is sometimes gone for weeks at a time. And I think in that situation, one of the things that I always try to get my grandparents to try to make sure that they have is that they have power of attorney for health care and educational decisions as much as possible. And so a lot of times when there is that kind of shared caregiving, one of the most important things is to make sure that it's like all caregivers who are engaged in healthcare provision and mental health care provision, all of them have the appropriate avenues to do that. And I have definitely, particularly in my private practice, I've had a couple of grandparents come through wanting their young child to be seen, but they did not have power of attorney, they did not have custody, and I had to get signatures from the parents before I felt like I could start that treatment. So I think one of the first things is just make sure, very simple thing that I think is, and I'm not a lawyer, but power of attorney laws are fairly similar in most of the states, that just making sure that folks have that power of attorney. The other dynamics that I see, though, is, some of the problematic dynamics all between the grandparent and the parent. We often very quickly turn to our grandparents as caregivers. In my slightly politically incorrect statement of the day, I have to have at least one, apparently. Sometimes those grandparents did not do a very good job raising the parents, which is the reason why their grandchildren found their care. And sometimes you still see some pretty significant challenges that the grandparents have with their parenting skills. And so when you have those kind of power dynamics where the grandparent is telling the parent what to do, but the grandparent is sometimes telling the parent things that are really not very helpful, I think one of the things that I most want to do is try to get the grandparent and the parent on the same page as quickly as possible. And quite honestly, I think that's where some of the evidence-based parenting practices, such as PCIT or Triple P or Incredible Years, etc., can be really helpful, because I think sometimes that can help to serve to get the parents and the grandparents on the same page.
Thank you very much. Thank you for sharing that and all the information that you shared in the content of your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Abner. We really appreciate your time today. And if we get any other questions later on, we'll get those to you and see if we can get some answers. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. It's been an honor being with you all today.
Thank you. So up next is Connie Wells. In addition to being a family member and parenting grandparent herself, Ms. Wells brings more than 29 years of experience in developing, founding, leading, and managing community, state, and national nonprofits, and developing and directing family and consumer-run programs. Ms. Wells is currently the Regional Director for Tennessee Voice for Children. Welcome, Ms. Wells. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. You know what's really interesting about me being a speaker and John being a speaker is that where he works is only about 20 miles from where I work. So not only are we both from Tennessee, we both work with people within the same community. So it's really exciting to be here today and be able to follow up from him and his insights. And as he was talking, I kept going back and thinking, wow, you know, he is right on. That's exactly what I'm seeing with the families that I'm working with in a much more informal manner. So trying to get there we go. I am with Tennessee Voices, and we're a collaborative leader that guides mental health transformation in the state of Tennessee. Our home office is right outside of Nashville. Tornado went close, but didn't do any damage, and all 67 of our employees are safe. So we were really excited about that. We have a statewide family network grant from SAMHSA, and this grant has enabled us to focus on northeastern Tennessee and try to understand and develop services that can be replicated and you could use in other places as well that had rural areas. And so I kind of stick with that. But also in the past fiscal year, Tennessee Voices reached more than 50,000 parents, caregivers, family members, and professionals. So they've kind of been the launch pin for connecting families and professionals and systems. Basically, the organization has several programs that they do: early childhood, family connection, juvenile justice reform, outpatient counseling, the statewide family network. They're also the trainer and assist in certifying family support specialists. We have something we call the Survivor Connection, which a lot of the grandparent families that we have come in through there. The Survivor Connection works with families who have been involved in the justice system somehow, whether that was through the Department of Children's Services and Child Welfare, or possibly a parent was arrested for something and the grandparent ended up with the children. Our statewide family network tries really hard to respond to the children and youth and the young adults, but really focusing on the Appalachian area. One of the reasons that we did that is it really seemed as though the services that were being developed in Nashville really wouldn't work over here. And when well-meaning and brilliant people came over from Nashville to our area, people just didn't show up, and they didn't listen to them the way that they do when you have something that's a little more focused for your area. So what we're trying to do is develop that model that can be used in other rural areas, really trying to build the capacity of communities to implement, expand, and improve effective family-driven mental health services, and really staying within respecting that culture, the traditions, and the beliefs of the people that are served. This is where we're located at. I always laugh and say, you know, I can go out my front door and jump real high and land in North Carolina or Virginia, but we are in the far northeastern corner. This has created some of its own challenges in that many of our families get services in another state. And a lot of times a grandparent can have a child living with them whose parents are actually from another state, or vice versa. So it does create all of its own challenges, as well as the cultures here are very diverse, as they are in any rural area. A lot of times folks think that just because you're in a rural area and you're not in a, you know, a big metropolitan city that has a blending of multiple cultures, they seem to think that rural areas do not have that diversity, when actually that's not true at all. They may not have racial diversity, but they definitely have cultural and traditional diversity. I like to liken the families that we work with as every ridge. The other side of the mountain is a different culture than the side of the mountain that you're on. They're very driven, the cultures are very driven by the families and their traditions. So we can't just say we're going to do things this way and expect that it's going to impact the families the way that we want to. So how do we get involved with the Grandfamilies, helping Grandfamilies? Certainly it's because of the work that we do. When we attend child and family team meetings for the Department of Children's Services, we, of course, run into families. Almost every meeting that I go to has a grandparent there. And sometimes the grandparent has custody. Sometimes, as we heard before, the child is living with a parent who's living with their parent. But so often that's one of the ways that we connect with these families. The other thing is I'm a grandparent raising a grandchild. I don't have custody of him. It's very informal. As we heard before, he lives with us. I can't make any legal decisions on his behalf. He has autism. He's 14 years old, and he needs a very predictable lifestyle. He needs things to be consistent, and that's just not possible with either his mother or his father. And I kind of laugh and say he's very well adapted to old people because we're the same way too. We kind of like to have things pretty static and the same, and it seems to benefit him very much. The other thing is that we run into a lot of families raising family members who are not grandparents. It might be an aunt, an uncle, and even neighbors or someone from the church. And while we like to focus on grandfamilies and grandparents, we often find those folks coming to us and to the meetings that we have and looking for similar types of support. I would say that about half of all the IEPs that I attend, I'm attending with a grandparent. So definitely grandparents seem to have a little more trouble understanding the school system. Schools are different than they used to be, and the way that they're run and the way that they work in terms of communication, a lot of schools, all the communication is electronic. Many of our grandparents do not do electronic communication. So the IEPs that I go to are often with grandparents. We had an Advocates Edge training last Saturday where we trained family members to be better advocates for themselves and others like them. And it was really interesting. Half of the people that came were also grandparents raising grandchildren. Our collaborators are mostly Omni Visions and the Community Action Board. Omni Visions provides a regional support network to promote family stability, and they create a separate support network outside of child welfare system of foster care for relative children not in state custody. And the Community Action Board is an independent local advisory board in each county made up of families, local public agencies, schools, health department, healthcare providers, juvenile court, law enforcement officials, and other community-based organizations, including family-run and consumer-run organizations that provide services for kids in that community. Now, they are completely separate. So there's one for Washington County, there's one for Carter County, there's one for Johnson County. And the reason for that is because they recognize the difference between the communities in terms of their traditions and their culture. And if they're truly going to be effective and assist the communities and the people that live there, they have to be responsive to that. Omni Visions has been a great partner with us. So Omni Visions has funding from the Department of Children's Services in the state of Tennessee, and that money is a blend of federal and state money. And there are many, many programs across the state that are relative caregiver programs funded by the same pot of money. Omni Visions will do an assessment of the needs. They provide home and community-based services. They sponsor relative caregiver support groups, which are really great, and I'll talk about those again in a minute. They have activities and support groups for children and teens, and educational workshops for children, teens, parents, and other relative caregivers. They provide respite and enrichment opportunities. They also have a family advocacy where they have short-term case management with caregivers and the children and the birth parents, trying to bring them together in a manner that meets the child's needs and helps move them towards whatever direction it is that they're going, whether that's reunification with their birth parents or a more stable and a formal relationship with their grandparents. They also assist with outreach, and they can be a one-time emergency or startup assistance. The eligibility for them is determined by existing and published DCS guidelines. That's our Department of Children's Services. So because it's funded by DCS, they have to meet those eligibility guidelines. The relative caregiver may have legal relationship with the child, or they may just be, as we are, raising the child informally. The caregiver has to be related to the child by blood, marriage, or adoption. And the caregiver must be able to provide a safe home and be committed to providing the home as long as necessary and appropriate. They have to be willing to take part in in-home assessments, and they have to agree to accept support services. It's all voluntary. And the caregivers are basically empowered to make informed and self-determined decisions regarding their interest in receiving services and support. So in other words, they have child and family team meetings with them as well, and they try to do everything that they can to help them recognize and understand exactly what it is that they need in order to do the job that they've been charged with doing, and that's raising this child. The community action boards, as I said, are very localized, and each advisory board recommends ways to bring together DCS, the families, available resource providers within the community. They work to develop formal and informal services, and they're kind of what I call an e-community. There's a monthly meeting each month, but in between the meetings, a lot is going on. So they'll highlight programs at the meeting and give updates and events, and they'll talk about specific needs. But for example, I got an email this morning from Carter County saying that there's a family that really needs some diapers, and that they're of a certain size, and is there anybody that can do it? Yesterday, there was a family that was really in need of a gas card because they had run out of money and didn't have gas to drive the child back and forth to appointments. And so they put that on there. There's probably, for every county, at least 75 to 100 people on those email lists. Each county email list is separate, and although there is some duplication across them, but when a request comes in, it can be shared with just that county, or it can be shared with everyone. So a lot of times we can quickly find, bunk beds, diapers, toilet paper, and different things that families have to have in order to meet the child's needs. So where do we fit in? Well, we participate and partner with everything that we do. We focus very closely on families of children with mental, emotional, or behavioral needs. And, of course, research shows that this population of kids is at very high risk for all of that, for all of the reasons that Dr. Abner said. We participate in those partner meetings. We monitor the emails and watch for trends to see what kinds of things families are in need of. We'll try to do some research and see where we can get those kinds of items for our families that we work with. We provide resources, trainings, and support. We participate in different events. We have social media pages that reach out to these families, and yes, the Grandfamilies Facebook is wonderful. We approach this in kind of a peer-to-peer way, we work closely with grandparents as grandparents. So we're not going to assign someone who's not a grandparent to work with a grandparent family because they have no idea what that feels like. I can't even get my own kids to understand how I feel towards my grandchildren. They only know how they feel as their children. They don't understand what it feels like to be a grandparent. So we really try to align people in a very peer-to-peer way. You know, we did focus groups through the Department of Children's Services with relative caregivers last spring. And we talked with about, I believe it was 30 or 40 families that were relative caregivers, and talked about, you know, what things work, what things don't work, what do you need, what is a surprise. And I would easily say that 90% of those families, what they were telling us is they did not understand their legal rights, either with the kids, with doctors, with the schools. Even if they had custody, they really weren't sure that they understood how to apply the legal system to what they were trying to get done. We did resource fairs, and these resource fairs are big around here. I don't know if they're big where you come from, but we were able to, this is prior to school starting, so they call them resource fairs, but they're school resource fairs, and they usually have them the week before school starts. And, you know, the community is giving out backpacks, all kinds of things. We had an opportunity to reach 2,500 families in less than a week. And that was really big. So there was someone there who was a provider of services with me as well as myself, and I could reach out to those grandparents, and they identified themselves very quickly. And it was real easy for us to automatically become peer-to-peer. All I had to say was, oh my gosh, yes, I'm raising my grandson too. And they open up and they talk about all the different kinds of things that they have to have and what they're not getting. What are our lessons learned? Wow. Each community is so unique that I really hope that folks understand we don't do a brochure that we print. If you've heard me speak before, I say this every time. We don't do brochures where we get 1,000 of them printed to hand out in the communities that we serve. No. We print those brochures specifically for the community that we're going to each and every time we go there. And we try to get someone in the community to let us know exactly what needs to be on it, what kind of pictures are going to be the best, and so on. There's a lot of variables that have to be considered when you're working with grandparents. For example, sometimes the other children do not understand why the grandparents would take these kids in. After all, they've already raised their kids. Why would we want to take in another child? We're done with that. So definitely the brothers and sisters of the child whose children you've taken into your home may not always agree with that, and they can give grandparents a pretty hard time. We learned that kids have to be able to attend the events. We think that it's hard to find babysitters in respite care for kids living with their parents. It's even harder for the grandparents because all their friends are old, and they've already raised their kids, and they're not in a position to take on other people's kids. The peer-to-peer is critical. Every time we get these families together, their chatter is amazing. They're helping one another. They're identifying issues. They're helping each other vocalize exactly what it is they're going through, and they're testing with one another what they need to say when they need to go and get that help. Isolation makes the events a huge deal. So figuring out the best time to have the meeting. Many times the grandparents are not working, and so they can come to a meeting in the middle of the day, and it's not a big deal. They can do it while the kids are at school. But a lot of times I've seen the grandparents have to go back to work. And so having it during noon hour in the community and providing lunch seems to make that a doable thing. The legal questions never seem to stop. And I will tell you, they tend to be little lawyers and want to help one another, and the best thing that we can do for them is bring in real legal representation to answer questions so that they're getting the right kind of advice. It was really interesting. One of the first things that they said they needed when they took on their grandchildren was they needed more laundry soap and toilet paper than they ever imagined that they would have to use. And they were so surprised that they ran out of them so fast. You also have to remember that these grandparents are grieving, as Dr. Abner said. They may have a child that's in jail. They may have a child who's on drugs and can no longer care for their child. They may very well have taken the kids, gone to children's services, and had the kids removed. Those are huge things for these families to have to process. So we have found that the grandparents need every bit as much of counseling and support as the children do. We had to remember that we were not replacing. I have to remind myself this every day. I am not replacing my son as the parent of the grandchild that I have in my house. I haven't replaced him, and I have a responsibility to both of them. Number one, to the child, to make sure that they're safe, to make sure that he has everything that he needs so he can be successful. But I also have a responsibility to my son to make sure that he understands what he needs to provide in order to take this responsibility back. And those are hard roles for grandparents to play. Some of the ideas of designing ways of approaching this, for the informal events that we've done have probably been some of the most rewarding in terms of bringing us and grandparents to where they are. Handing out free things. So when I look at ordering, stuff we're going to hand out, I look very carefully at things being not cute, but practical. Things that stress balls are great. Notebooks. Providing them with, what would be big? If I could find toilet paper that was swag and had our name on the outside, that would be a biggie. But things like that, the anti-bac is a big deal. Flashlights, different things that we can provide them with that they can use once they get home. Because to be honest, every penny they have is going towards their own needs and then the needs of the children, and they run short every month. Another thing that has been really beneficial is getting books for them and handing them out to them. Books on grandparenting, books on raising children with special needs, books on children's mental health, books on schools, books on advocacy. So whenever we get a chance, we get those books, we bring it to them at a meeting, and we sit down and go through the book with them and point out specific areas that might help them. And then again, school supplies are a big thing. We also like to bring in professional speakers, especially lawyers, educators, and counselors. Counselors are great, and so are psychologists, and they often have a lot of questions about medication and about HIPAA and who can share information and when can they share information. So those kinds of things should all be taken into consideration when you're designing a program for grandparents. I really, of course, this is because the older I get, the less I can remember, but developing a formal outreach plan seems to be really important. It's one of the best ways to engage partners because it becomes less of a let's just talk about it to let's go ahead and do it. Locate the matriarchs in each of the communities. Up in Mountain City, I tried to get in there to work with families, and I wasn't making any headway at all until I met the matriarch of the community And she was the person you had to go through. She had to vet me. She had to approve me to work with the families there and then say to the families, hey, this is Connie, and it's okay for you to work with her. Old-fashioned peer-to-peer informal support networks are critical as well. Making sure that when families get together, it's not a professional just talking to them and telling them what to do, but it's an actual conversation. And in our area, I'll tell you, Facebook is big. Families tend to want to get their resources off Facebook, so we have a Facebook page for Northeastern Tennessee where we try really hard to make sure that anything that we post is true and that it's helpful. So we post on that. Very seldom will someone say, you know, anything about it, but they often will tell us if they've missed us for a week. And I think that the final thing is to remember that when you reach out to people, make sure you're talking in a language that they understand. Recently, I read about a support group that was going to be in Johnson City. And the support group was, I think, intended for families who had a child with autism. But the way that it read was for families raising a neurodiverse child. My families don't understand what that means. So you've got to use the language that they all understand and use the language that they use, which I take you back to the language that they use in Mountain City is different than the language that they use in Johnson City, different than in Kingsport. So it's really critical to us that we not produce 1,000 brochures that are all in one language because we do have to adapt it. Finally, there's some great resources out there. Grandfamilies has state fact sheets where you can go and find the fact sheet about what's going on in your state relative to grandfamilies. The AARP has wonderful information, and they often have lawyers write articles that are of great interest. There's a help guide, and then, of course, there's many grandparents raising grandchildren online support groups. So that's all I wanted to bring to you today. You know, certainly you have my email address if you want any information specifically on some of the stuff we're doing. If you want to borrow any of our plans or any of the things that we use when we're working with grandfamilies, please feel comfortable in doing that. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Christina.
Oh, thank you so much, Connie. Let's hear from our audience. We often have great ideas and suggestions out there in the community. So if you have any questions for Connie, now's your chance. Also, if there's anything you'd like to share as a resource, tip, lessons learned, let's hear what people out there have to say. We know that you're doing some great things in the community. At the beginning, lots of people said they have programs serving grandfamilies. Let us know if there's something that that you'd like to share. I do have one question that had come to mind that maybe you can help us with, Connie. I know that sometimes grandparents feel this conflict between their grandchildren that they're raising and the grandchildren that visit. And sometimes that creates some additional challenges. Have you kind of experienced that? Do you see that's often a problem?
Well, it certainly is in our family, and it's tough. It's tough to justify and validate. I mean, I'm supposed to love all of my grandchildren equally, and I do. But some of them need more help than others, and so I try to meet those needs. Sometimes the other grandchildren look at that as favoritism. And we've discussed this at a couple of family support group meetings where, you know, it seems to be a universal problem, and actually some grandchildren stop coming over to visit their grandparents because they can't deal with that added burden. So, yes, definitely. And I think I went through this just this morning, trying to explain why I did something for one grandchild that I didn't do for another, and it was simply based on need. And I don't know if they're going to understand that, and I guess the only thing we can do is recognize that that is an issue that grandparents do face, and be ready to support them. Bring in a counselor maybe to talk specifically to grandfamilies about what happens when you have to do more for one child than you do for the other, and the other child gets jealous. So I think that's a really great question, and I think it's a wonderful topic for meetings, and I know it would be very well received.
And I think when I heard that, I was a little shocked because that hadn't occurred to me as one of the challenges. Parenting is challenging enough, but to add that extra dimension to it was definitely difficult. We've also heard some challenges from grandparents who were living maybe in older adult high-rise or older adult housing, and not being able to keep their children living at their residence because of the limitations of their community. Have you run across that in Tennessee?
Yes, we've heard of families that actually have had to, grandparents that have moved just so that they could take care of their children, their children's children. But I think more often what happens is then the family turns to other family members like aunts and uncles and try to get the kids there. I have to say, very honestly, I know that my grandson Robbie is not living the typical life of other kids that are 14 years old. We're not into the community the way that parents are because of our age. We're not linked in that language. That was so funny when Dr. Abner talked about the language differences. The language differences are huge here at our house, and they're a source of a lot of entertainment, I think, for Robbie. But definitely where the family lives does dictate how involved they are in the child's community, the school, ball games, all those kinds of things. And many of the grandparents that I work with have told me that putting their grandchild in t-ball or trying to do extracurriculars with them just did not happen because they were too exhausted, didn't have the opportunity, or didn't have the money to do it.
I can completely understand how that would be one of the challenges that a family could face. I actually have met a great-grandparent raising their great-grandchildren. So I'm sure the problem is much larger than we think.
If you could see me on camera, you would have seen me just put my hands on my head. I have great-grandchildren, and 5 of them, and the oldest one is 4, and I cannot imagine it. I just cannot imagine keeping up with that level of energy. So my heart sure goes out to them.
Connie, this is Matt. A quick question that comes to mind is a lot of families that I'm working with as they transition from kind of an unofficial type of guardianship to official guardianship. They have some questions about finances. And do you see any implications of that? Maybe it's around taxes, or maybe it's around income or health insurance and eligibility for things. I know I'm in the state of Illinois, and there are specific programs that will support grandparents raising grandchildren. Is that something that's universal across the nation, or what kind of challenges might exist when they go to that official guardianship?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a huge issue. A lot of times, the reason that the grandchild is living with the grandparent is because of financial issues. The parents couldn't provide for them. The parents didn't have a job. They didn't have transportation. When the parents start losing some of the perks that they have as being a parent, such as food stamps, Social Security, SSI. We have families where the grandparent is raising the child without that formal paper giving them custody, simply because if they didn't let the parents keep the Social Security income, the parents would take the kid away, and it would be detrimental to the child. So our grandparents are making a lot of accommodations for keeping that grandchild in their house. One of the things I really recommend is getting someone, a lawyer's great, lawyer's wonderful, but it's also good to get someone from Social Security there and talk with them about, what you can and can't do, what's legal and what's not legal. I've heard of some arrangements that I highly questioned about why was the parent still getting all of these benefits when the child never even lived with them for a year. So I think that getting someone in that can talk with the grandparents about that, again, we don't want to go against our kids because if we don't have custody and the state hasn't determined that they're neglectful, they can take the grandchild away anytime. And so I think, it's a really good question, Matt. It forces grandparents to do things not always in the best interest of the grandparents and the child.
That's a really scary challenge, I think, for grandfamilies, because they know their grandchild is safe with them. Mm-hmm. And are willing to make those sacrifices for safety and to keep the child with the family. That sounds like grandfamilies are in a lot of tough spots.
Yeah, they are. They are.
The one last thing that I will share is I put a link up that there is actually a bill that's still looking for some sponsors that has some bipartisan support. I'm not doing any kind of, like legislation suggestions here, but people may want to take a look at it and see if it's something that you might think is useful to bring to people in your state if you think that they might be interested in getting behind it, because it does talk a little bit about providing some financial relief to grandparents. I don't know necessarily the ins and outs, but if anybody's interested, you may want to check it out. If we don't have, oh, go ahead.
Christina, that's a really good point to bring up. I was going to mention that in July of 2018, President Trump did sign into law the Supporting Grandparents Raising Grandchildren Act. And I really encourage people to Google that and see what it means. And they have established a federal advisory committee of grandparents that are raising grandchildren to help advise the federal government on how to implement the bill. So I really do recommend folks going and taking a look at that. And it also provides money to states to start certain initiatives to enable them to better meet the needs of grandparents raising grandchildren.
Excellent point. I did put the link up to the advisory committee, the advisory council, for that's based on that law. So that's something that's really helpful for grandfamilies, and people should definitely take a look at that as well. So hopefully times are changing to provide some more relief for our vulnerable grandparents. But thank you, everyone. Thank you so much to both of our presenters, Dr. Abner, Connie Wells. It sounds like Tennessee is really out there working very hard, doing their best for grandfamilies, and thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your insight. We really, really appreciate it. Up on the screen is the emails in case you would like to get in touch with our presenters. And thank you so much for your time and attendance today. I'd ask that everyone take a moment and complete the survey, give us some feedback. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.